ago, I never saw myself owning what they call an M-Lite. I always thought if I was going to own a BMW one day, it'd have to be a fully blown M car like an M2 or M3. But after owning my M140i for a few weeks now, I've completely fallen in love with it. The power on tap, practicality of it, and build quality is just second to none for a hot hatch. And apart from the inconvenience of having to visit the Shell garage 3 times a week to brim the tank, I'd recommend these cars to anyone who's after the perfect all-rounder. I'll admit I did end up with one of these because a deal with an M2 fell through, but there are plenty of other options out there on the market for the same price that I could have gone for rather than the 140, like the Golf R, S3 or A45 AMG. And yet, ultimately it comes down to your own personal preference, but I thought I'd run through the reasons why I decided to go for the 1 Series and share a few facts and figures that swayed me into making the choice that I did. Let's get into it. So let's start with money because, well, I've got to start somewhere I guess. I'll just quickly explain the situation with the M2. I was going to finance it, which isn't as dreadful as everyone thinks it is, but I'll leave that for another video. And it was all going well until I had to sign on the dotted line. All of the figures had been fiddled by that sodding car salesman, so much so that the monthly payments were ridiculous and I wasn't willing to spend that amount a month. I mean, I could go out and buy one, but the whole reason for going down the PCP route was so I didn't have to plough 30 G's into a car. If I was buying a car outright, the max I was happy spending was around 20 grand, and as you probably know, you can't get a straight M2 for that yet, unfortunately. So albeit a bit disheartened, I had to give up on the idea of an M2. Well, for now. Automatically, I was drawn towards the M240, since it's an obvious choice for someone who either can't quite make it into an M2 just yet, or simply can't justify spending the extra £10,000 for one. But I had a feeling if I bought one of those, I'd just have a constant reminder sat on the driveway of that failed M2 mission, so I started to look at alternatives to that as well. Now if it's purely 0 to 60 times that you care about, then there are a lot of options that you can get with a budget of 20 grand. The used car market has anything from old executive Jags to fairly recent E92 M3s, but personally I was wanting something a bit newer that had been well looked after and had all of the creature comforts that we can't seem to live without nowadays, and I fairly sharply narrowed it down to this list. The Golf R, Mercedes A45 AMG, an Audi S3, but it had to be the saloon of course, and finally the BMW M140i. No big surprises there really, eh? When buying a car with 300 plus brake, I really didn't want front wheel drive, and although I'm sure the Leon and Civic are great cars, and you know, they've proved it on the Nürburgring, they just weren't for me. I wasn't particularly looking at hatches either, but I'm just not a great fan of the big saloons unless they're the spicy editions like the M3 or RS5, and you aren't picking a newish one of those up for 20k, I'll tell you that for free. Obviously, I went for the M140 over some other popular cars, and the first reason was the power that you get from the standard block. Both the Golf and the S3 are around 300 brake, give or take a few, and the Mercedes obliterates that with 360 as standard. In the book, the B58 power in the 140 should sit right in the middle at 335 bhp, but most people who've dynoed these things have found out that's generally not the case. The majority of dyno runs that I've seen have been around the 360 brake mark, but I've seen results as high as 380. There's nothing to say that the one that you buy won't be a measly old 335 horsepower. God, it'll barely move that. But the B58 is an absolute tank of an engine, and its options for tuning are ridiculous when I started looking into it. There's at least 3 companies I can think of, without googling any more, that allow you to map your car just sat on your driveway, and I'm fairly sure in saying that you can push these things to, and maybe over 450 bhp, without having to do any physical bolt-on modifications, which is absolutely mental. So yeah, 1 tick for the bimmer. I touched on price earlier because it was the main thing that helped me narrow down my choices to these 4, but after scouring through thousands of for sale ads online, £20,000 gets you 4 very different cars, age and condition wise. I was after a pretty highly spec'd low mileage car, not just for me to enjoy while owning it, but I thought it'd be a bit easier to sell later down the line as well. And if you look at the top spec editions of each car I had on my shortlist, you'll see that the mileage varies quite a bit. For 20 grand, the majority of A45s were already 7 years old and on the wrong side of 60k miles. That's with all of the nice options ticked. Whereas the Golf and BM were generally sub 30,000 miles and half the age. The S3 floated somewhere in between, but more often than not you'd see them advertised with about 40k on the clock. So that was another tick for the 140 and the first one for the Golf. Pretty bad news about the Merc, but you do get the odd unicorn that comes up for sale every now and again, so I didn't completely wipe them from my search straight away. Next up was the styling, which was the main reason why I kept the Merc at the back of my mind, because with the aero pack fitted, I think it is probably the best looking car out of the 4, but you either love it or hate it because there's no in between with that, it's just so leery. The BM was a close second just because the interior lets it down a bit. Even with the options that I ended up choosing on my car, I still don't think it's as nice as the Merc's interior, especially with those AMG seats and the pan roof, which is something that you can't even get on the 1 Series, just a bog standard sunroof. The Golf and S3 are really quite subtle both inside and out compared to the A45 and the 140. Still smart, but just not as likely to snap someone's neck when you're out on a drive. However, the newer models come with a quality dashboard, which is basically 90% screen, and to be fair, there are a lot of OEM plus bolt-on exterior mods which bring these things to life. But remember, I'm just talking about the standard cars at the moment. I'll leave the modded ones until the next video. So that's a tick for the Merc. Next up was running costs, because there's no point in owning one of these if you aren't going to be able to afford to hammer it every now and again. Now, I haven't actually done a track day as of yet, but I was wanting to break my V in whatever I was going to buy next. So within the running costs, I looked at everything from tax, insurance and MPG for everyday driving, to the prices of spare pads, tyres and fluids for when I eventually man up, turn the PlayStation off and go drive an actual car around a track for a change. These results are going to vary depending on who you are because, well, insurance and that. But for me, the S3 and the Golf are the best in this department. Cheaper parts than both the BM and the Merc, cheaper to service, more fuel efficient, well, who cares about that, and cheaper to insure. The Mercedes came in a close third behind those two, and the tyre shredding 140 was dead last, but you can't put a price on going sideways in your own tyre smoke, can you? Well, you can actually, it's about 420 quid a pop. Even though it's a 3 litre petrol, the tax was actually cheaper on the BM, only about 150 quid. But the way it burns that jungle juice and the price of servicing cemented it right at the back of the field. Anyway, that means the Golf and S3 get a big tick next to them, and that's pretty much everything covered. Price, power, looks, and running costs. All of that, and it still looks like I was undecided, doesn't it? But after test driving them all, the 140 stood out so much more than the rest, I really can't describe it. Maybe it's the feeling that on every upshift you have to wrestle with it as it tries to squirm and put its power down, and if you get it all wrong, it'll send you off into a tree, which had me hooked. I don't know, but it was a hell of a lot more exciting to drive. Don't get me wrong though, the other three handle absolutely mint. It genuinely feels like you're on rails going round bends, especially in that Merc, and the launches you can get these things with 4-wheel drive is astonishing. But the Beamer, even with the 8-speed auto box rather than that manual, feels like so much more of a driver's car. Cringy as when people say that, but it's true. Like I say though, it's all personal preference. There's a reason that all 4 of these cars that I was looking at are as popular as they are. And if I had the money, I'd love to take one of the 4-wheel drive boys as well, but I could only choose one, and this time round it had to be the one that's going to cost me more money in the long run, didn't it, for fuck's sake. But it puts a massive smile on my face every single time that I drive it, and that's all that matters. As much as I think this car is great standard, of course I'm going to start messing around with it because I'm an idiot. So stick around and subscribe if you want to watch me do that. I also want to see if I've made the right choice buying this thing, so I've got a few trips planned out as well as videos with some high-powered versions of each car that I've been talking about, which I am really looking forward to. Hey. I hope you enjoyed the video, leave it a like if you did, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!